The Last of Us Part 2 was recently released on the PS4, the follow-up to its critically acclaimed predecessor, The Last of Us. Part 2 follows a revenge tale of two different survivors, a quarter of a century after a fungal plague wipes out most of humanity. The hype surrounding the sequel has been immense. It might be the most highly anticipated game of its time, and the backlash since its release might be even greater, which has sparked me to make this video. Trying to follow up from the previous title, The Last of Us Part 2 was practically bound to be a train wreck in comparison. Suffice it to say, the game's not a train wreck. In fact, in the age of soulless cash grab sequels, it might be the most honest attempt at a follow up in a decade. Now don't get me wrong, the game makes blatantly huge errors along the way and struggles to tie everything together, something I'll point out several times in this video. But in terms of what it set out to do, it achieves it to a satisfying level. This video will express where the game succeeded and where I think it failed, but overall how it strived to create an experience that tried to ultimately risk being different while keeping the spirit of the original title. I will be directly comparing this game to its predecessor, 2013's The Last of Us, which I'll be referring to as Part 1 for brevity's sake, so full spoilers for both games from here on out. Let's start by defining what Last of Us Part 2 actually is. It's a movie and a game stitched together. Lengthy cutscenes matched with player-controlled gameplay segments. Occasionally we get a combination of the two, where the game attempts to achieve both at the same time. Sometimes the gameplay and the movie blend together quite nicely, other times they seem to be in opposition with each other. Now I'm not here to criticise games that lean more into movie type experiences. I'm only going to evaluate how successful they were in either category or at merging the two together, judging the game by its own merits. So let's begin. After a 7-year gap between the titles, the game starts with a very well directed cutscene of Joel giving us a recap of the previous game, framed as a conversation of him telling the truth behind the events that occurred in the hospital to his brother Tommy. Naughty Dog even went through the effort of redoing certain cutscenes of Part 1 in the new engine. I'll admit, watching the old ones would be quite jarring with the new graphics. Even still, I appreciate the effort was made there. A minor detail of the previous game of Joel killing the head doctor is now given more precedent in this retelling. Thankfully, the whole thing is kept short and sweet. Truthfully, the recap could have been thrown in the main menu somewhere, but at the very least it plays into the larger story, justifying its inclusion. After a brief riding section, we're reintroduced to Ellie. This re-establishes the tenuous relationship Joel and Ellie had with each other after the previous game's ending, while also displaying how much the characters care for each other, showing how much they'll play up to each other for civility's sake. It's a great and understated moment.
Do you remember the joke?
In the lead up to Part 1's ending, both Joel and Ellie had changed. Joel, after opening up about his daughter, warmed up more as a character. Ellie on the other hand seemed to have grown more distant from the world. After preparing her whole being to save humanity and it to result in nothing, Ellie had lost most of her spark by the time the credits rolled. So I'm glad to see this aspect of her character carried over to the sequel, as I was afraid Part 2 might retcon this. Now the song Joel sings is a little on the nose. Thankfully the way characters are feeling are presented more through body language rather than explicitly stated in the dialogue, something the new and improved graphics could afford them. Naughty Dog has always had state-of-the-art graphics. With that said, on a technical level, they have somehow continued to outdo themselves. It is truly an achievement the amount of detail on offer. The facial animations alone are a sight to behold. And it doesn't just look good for vanity's sake. The attention to detail in the buildings and the environment speaks volumes about the world through environmental storytelling. Moreover, the believable weapon sway, enemy AI and character animations helps place us in what feels like a tangible world. The realistic animations also have another huge benefit here. They tell us a vast amount about the characters through their interactions with each other than arguably any piece of dialogue ever could. And Naughty Dog still seems to be one of the few developers in the game industry to recognise this. Ultimately, the prologue is just showing us things that we should already know. It's nothing more than a lengthy cutscene with minor inputs from the player, not even forwarding the story in any real way. Despite this, these two scenes do help capture both the tone and the atmosphere after the previous game's ending, so when the sequel shifts to a much darker tone, it has something to contrast against from earlier, making them a worthwhile inclusion. Now, arguably the placement of the museum flashback does this better, highlighting some of the good times Joel and Ellie had in the centre of a grim story. Even still, the relationship is at the core of the rest of the game's narrative, so it was a worthwhile inclusion to have these here for that reason alone. We then cut forward 4 years into the future, and the relationship is very different. Somewhat surprisingly, Joel takes a huge backseat in this game. Now, while I'll defend the game's prologue, the rest of the opening I'm not so sure of. The game takes an incredibly long time to get started. In truth, the game only really gets going 2 hours in, when Ellie and Dina are in Seattle and the cutscenes and gameplay interruptions ease off. After a 4-year jump, time was needed to reintroduce everything, making interactivity by the player happen in spots. I'll confess, the snowball fight is an interesting way of doing a tutorial, and is enjoyable for what it is. But apart from showing the player that he can crouch behind things and fire projectiles, it doesn't achieve much. We are playing a third-person shooter after all. These mechanics are expected at this point, let alone being a sequel to Part 1, where the player has prior knowledge of these mechanics. To the game's credit, there is a lot going on here. A bunch of new and returning characters, with new relationships introduced. And the slow start does help acclimate us to the new relationship dynamics. We pick up on the fact that Joel and Ellie seem to have drifted apart over the years, while Ellie and Dina are shown to be attracted to each other. Ellie was outright stated to be gay in the Left Behind DLC, so I'm glad the game doesn't do a big song and dance about it here. Honestly, it doesn't add much to Ellie as a character, but at the very least it gives Dina slightly more relevance in the plot. Most importantly out of the opening is the introduction of Abby and her group. The game clearly has a lot of plates spinning here, and is an attempt to be concise at the very least. But it's all incredibly slow. This gets taken even further when you consider the fact that the game practically starts all over again when you start playing as Abby in the second half, adding to the amount of time when the player is almost doing nothing interesting. This brings us to the most jarring part of Part 2's opening, the cutting between Ellie and Abby, who initially seemed to have no connection to each other. It was something I didn't expect, considering Part 1 was one long cross-country trek focusing on Joel, with playing as Ellie being fairly unexpected. While Abby is playable and given great attention from the get-go. Still, Abby's sections boil down to more tutorials. To be fair, they're incredibly well scripted and have some great action, a motif the rest of our campaign will follow later in the game. Nevertheless, most of it practically plays itself. With our motivations being unclear at this point, there was no reason for the player to care about Abby or her safety. The only benefit to having the two branching narratives is that it does foreshadow you playing as Abby later and adds some mystery to the plot. Even so, the player is still playing the waiting game here, as everything is set up for the narrative. Abby's sequence introduces the new dodge mechanic, which believe it or not was present in the early builds of Part 1 before it was cut. In Part 1, enemies were slow to react, so it was far too easy to rush an enemy or have an enemy rush you and just smash the melee button, as once you landed the first strike, it would put the enemy in a stunned animation and there was very little they could do to get out of it. Overall, making melee kills far too easy and rewarding, as you wouldn't use up resources. This has been balanced out by making the bandits react faster. They're now super accurate if you rush them head on, discouraging that behaviour. Enemies' ability to defend melee attacks have been greatly increased, and they can now retaliate back. So the player has the new dodge mechanic in order to help against that tactic, as most enemies tend to rush you. There's not much to say about it. It works exactly how it sounds. Press the button at the right time and you'll dodge the attack, giving you a chance to counter back or flee. It's not a bad inclusion, and it rewards the player for staying on their toes. Although, they should have put a limit on how many times the player can use it in quick succession, similar to Bayonetta, where her dodge ends in a reset animation after it's executed in rapid succession, meaning there's a limit to it being spammed by a player with poor timing. I personally found Part 2's dodge window to be far too generous, making it easy to exploit it to kill enemies with your knife or fists, saving you from using your ammo and items. Overall, while melee combat is still not uncomplicated, there is more of a back and forth, rather than being genuinely one-sided in the player's favour, like in Part 1. While I was not too keen on Abby's early sections, the opening is not all bad in terms of gameplay. Ellie's parts with Dina fare much better here, with some optional areas to scavenge thrown in. Her and Dina's interactions help catch you up on the 4-year gap as you explore. They also do a decent job at world building, and it's subtle at the very least. For example, when trivial high school drama seems to be your biggest problem in a post-apocalyptic society, Life must be going well for your characters.
You never really talked to me about Kat. Yeah, 'cause there isn't much to talk about. Yow.
The purpose of these sections are also very clear. These sections want to introduce new, but mostly old mechanics in a relatively safe environment, while also furthering Ellie and Dina's relationship. In fact, death is almost used as a learning tool in these early sections, due to your lack of gear. Trying to shoot or melee your way out of a bad situation usually leads to death, putting the emphasis on stealth, a motif the rest of Ellie's campaign will follow. Here Dina will show the player how to create a Molotov, and we're introduced to the rework crafting mechanic. A small mechanic in part 1 where the crafting items could overlap, the main one being introduced here. A choice between crafting a Molotov or a medkit, as they both cost the same amount of resources. Although it was very minor, it could lead to some interesting moments for the player. Naughty Dog seem to have recognised this. Now this subtle choice has been turned into the core behind the crafting system in part 2. It's simplistic early on, but gets much better as more craftable items are introduced. Not only has the crafting system been greatly expanded, everything is a toss-up between something else. Since there are so many, and it's not the most overly complex system to warrant explaining, I'll sum up the core of the idea. Crafting presents itself as a choice between items, rather than just being a singular gain. Overall, it works well to keep the player making interesting decisions, especially when it's happening in real time in a tense combat situation. As for Ellie and Dina's relationship here, it arguably happens too fast. It's clear they have a past friendship together, but even with that concession, I still think it feels rushed. Even with all that being said, I'm glad the game doesn't waste any more time on it than it needed to. The opening is slow enough as it is. If you've played the previous title, which the majority of people have, you can't help but feel you're going through the motions at this point. It's never a good feeling waiting around for the true game to start. Obviously you need context to get the ball rolling, and cutscenes are great for that. Nevertheless, the more the player can run around exploring, fighting and puzzle solving without the game wresting control away, the better the overall experience will be, even a story focused game like The Last of Us. Thankfully, it isn't too long before you're reintroduced to the infected. Both campaigns do a little foreshadowing here for later, as Abby's sections are incredibly action oriented, while Ellie's parts seem to be more stealth focused. A trend both campaigns will continue to follow. My heart sank a little when I noticed the runner infected played identical to part 1. But they're actually one of the few types of infected not to be reworked in some way. Clickers are introduced earlier with Dina. They're back with some small changes. Instead of just having to move slowly around them like part 1, clickers can now do a screech alerting them to the player's presence if you're exposed to it, making staying in cover more important than ever. It's an incredibly minor change, but a most welcome one. After the first game, clickers lost most of the tension they created by the end, but this minor tweak in part 2 helps them gain some of that back. They can often trap you in a doorway if you're not careful, meaning players need to be aware of their surroundings. This new ability is somewhat undermined early on, as Ellie can still instantly stealth kill one from behind with a switchblade. Abby on the other hand will have to craft shivs, just like part 1. Thankfully, they can still one-shot the player if they grab you, so they still require much of the player's attention, both in stealth and combat. Abby's shivs initially seems like a downgrade, but actually allows her to defend the clicker's instant kill at the cost of one, although it's a little contrived to make it work. I found myself asking the question to why Ellie just doesn't use her knife in the same scenario. Regardless, this minor gameplay concession does help give clickers a different feel for Abby. While with Ellie you often need to retreat, Abby can stay in the heart of the action longer. Speaking of Abby, eventually Abby meets up with Joel and Tommy. After a tense encounter with the infected, she brings the two back to her group. Now before the game can really get going, the game needs to justify its existence in the first place. This comes at the brutal killing of Joel, setting in motion the entire revenge story. Now, it's arguable whether the game has one twist or two, the new protagonist Abby, or the killing of Joel. Either way, I'm glad the game saves time by introducing both back to back. The opening tutorials seem to run in opposition with the story at this point. Joel's early death works on the fact that you've played the previous game to the end, while the slow tutorials and the build-up of previous established mechanics suggest you've never played the previous game. And I can't be sure why the game was designed this way, presumably to accommodate both new and returning players, which seems like a no-win situation to me, as trying to placate both, you satisfy neither. It's not a complicated game mechanically, and there's already a very in-depth tutorial menu to help rusty and new players. Not to mention the in-game tips that appear after you die. Either way, it hurts repeat playthroughs due to the slow opening. You could argue his death comes out of nowhere, but in retrospect I wouldn't agree with that. Clearly Abby's group has a grudge against someone that is hiding in Jackson. It categorically could only be Joel or Tommy. Otherwise, from a narrative perspective, what would be the point? Let's face it, Tommy is unlikely. Joel is the only one we know who went on a murdering spree in part 1, ending the cure for humanity in the process. Logically, this was all bound to happen. Stopping the cure for humanity was too big an incident for there not to be consequences at some point, especially in a follow-up. And you don't name your game part 2 unless it's going to directly follow up the narrative consequences of the first title. When Abby then goes against Owen, putting herself at huge risk in a race to track down the perpetrator by herself, clearly only one thing is on her mind. Soon after, when she runs into Tommy and Joel, his death is practically set in stone at that point. I'll admit, it's an extraordinary convenience that she manages to find both Joel first, and that quickly. Not to mention that Joel is awfully calm about the whole thing. Now, it was in and after the pandemonium of almost being killed, so the characters are literally only catching their breath at this point. So, debatably, they can't reasonably react to the entire situation. But the time I twigged this wasn't going to end well, Joel gets shot, and I knew something sinister was up, and I still wasn't sure what was going to happen. Joel had less information than I did, so in that sense it was somewhat believable. Now I'll admit, you can make any excuse you want for Joel's character to be suspicious or not. The fact that you need to make excuses doesn't bode well for the game. But if we start nitpicking every questionable plot contrivance, we'll be here all day. Overall, if it means it doesn't get dragged out any longer and gives the narrative a tangible goal with some momentum attached, I'm okay with it. As, at this point, I've been playing almost 2 hours of mostly linear gameplay with no stakes in the story. Now, in spite of all that, I will still say Joel's death feels unexpected. It's probably because he survived till the end of the last game. If you're going to kill him, why not place it there for more of an emotional impact? Making it seem strange to kill him off so early into part 2, at least from a player's perspective. We only get to see Joel very briefly, and we don't get to see Joel and Ellie together until well after he dies. Even then, it's only in flashbacks, adding to the heartbreak of it all. Joel's early death is what I believe caused some of the biggest backlash, and it's easy to understand why. Joel in the run-up to the sequel had become an enormously popular character. His deplorable but understandable choices at the end of part 1 made him an incredibly empathetic character. Even all the immoral actions he'd taken, we had full context for them, making them understandable. Most importantly out of all of this was that Joel was fundamentally likeable. His interactions with Ellie humanised him, and the relationship brought his character back to a point to something we've seen before the infection started. Joel seemed like a good guy, struggling to take care of his daughter before this whole disaster started. So, despite him killing dozens of people by the ending of part 1, Joel came off as nothing more than just a pathetic lonely old man, who only wanted his father-daughter relationship back after losing Sarah. It was clear by the end, now that he had Ellie to replace her, nothing would stop him from keeping that relationship. I think Tommy says it best at the beginning of part 2.
I can't say I'd have done different.
Despite humanity's future at stake, it's tough to judge the man, for it's hard to say anyone who's in Joel's position would do anything different. That was the genius of the first game's focus into delivering that message. It was at the forefront of the first game from the very beginning, from Sarah's tragic death to when you run into Ellie. It's clear what the game's intentions were. Abby, on the other hand, besides her clear grudge against Joel, is a complete mystery. She looks like someone trying too hard to be seen as intimidating, lacking any redeeming factors at this point. After a 4-year gap, we were all waiting for Joel to be reintroduced. After Ellie and others mentioning him a few times, hinting that Ellie and him are having trouble, they had built an anticipation there. We all wanted to see what Ellie and Joel's relationship had become after 4 years together. but we only get to interact with Joel once in the present, and it's as Abby. It was an incredibly cruel choice to have the player control her right up to the point where she shoots him. You can't help but feel like you're somewhat responsible for what happens next. How mercilessly Abby wails on Joel with the golf club only drives home how much we as a player are not going to like her. She shows no remorse, and clearly she's getting some sort of emotional catharsis out of it. While we as the player are having the exact opposite feeling. While she's finally putting an end to an overdue grudge, we as the player are forming one against her. How well this subversion works is a matter of debate. I'll concede it's messy. I mean, Abby got Joel right where she wanted him, putting him in the most compromised position by sheer dumb luck. Nevertheless, the lead up to his death as Ellie is incredibly well handled. Hearing Joel's screams of pain echo when you enter and search the house. To his eventual reveal at the bottom of the stairs is nothing short of horrific. This is where the prologue scenes really benefit in re-establishing that relationship. It's one of the reasons I believed it was called Part 2 instead of the plain 2 title, as all of this hinges on the fact that you've experienced the first game. So it's a shame the game's tutorials don't share that same judgment in design. Nevertheless, watching Ellie beg for Joel to get up hit a very powerful note with me. Even despite the big gap between the games, it still manages to punch with a lot of emotional weight. Especially in retrospect, after it's revealed that Ellie knew the truth about the cure at this point and still wanted desperately for Joel to survive.
Get up! Joel, fucking get up! Please stop! Please don't shoot!
Joel's death lacks any fanfare or subtlety. It's just a man being brutally beaten with no remorse. The whole thing is sadistically cruel and woefully unsatisfying. But that's why it works for me, and I'll go into all the reasons why. To start, it works on just a raw surface level, setting the stage for a revenge tale. Watching the main protagonist of Part 1 get brutally beaten to death by the supposed villain works both as a player incentive and as a motivation for Ellie to see the story out to the end. You can't get a more powerful way of having the player have a real intrinsic grudge against Abby. Every action Ellie takes now has a real sense of weight behind it. Now it doesn't have the stakes of trying to save humanity's future as Part 1, but as a more low-key personal tale of Ellie seeking catharsis for the grief of Joel's death. You couldn't set the stage better. In that way, it has more agency than the first game, as Joel never really cared about the cure, while this is the only thing that matters to Ellie. It's personal for both you and Ellie now. To be feeling exactly like the protagonist is the goal of any character-driven narrative, and they achieve it here. Furthermore, it sets the game's tone perfectly. You can't get a better representation of what a grim experience you're in for than having a beloved character killed in front of you with no fanfare. Secondly, The Last of Us is a very character-driven plot, and Joel as a character had nothing else to offer. His character purpose was done, and there was no story to be told there. Joel's arc finished at the end of the last game, and his character had come full circle at this point. Part 1 was his story in no uncertain terms, with the ending showing how much respect the writers had for him, as Joel remains true to himself for the whole experience.
I swear.
Subsequently, there was little more story to tell for him. After accepting his father-daughter relationship with Ellie, he was content to live that life for the rest of his life.
Please. You just come after her.
This is why Part 1 the ending worked as well as it did. Both characters had accepted each other, and the relationship was now reciprocal. In order to keep that relationship, Joel would continue to lie, and it was ambiguous whether Ellie truly believed it or not. It's that very reason why the story ended there. If Ellie was ever to find out the truth, it would completely destroy that relationship, which was the very reason Joel told that lie in the first place, so he could maintain it. The entire game was built around Joel understandably making that ending decision. As such, it really capped off the story in a very meaningful way. So in Part 2, Joel was kind of stuck in limbo. He was more or less trapped as a character after Part 1, as if he was to change in any way, such as regretting what he did, or go so far as telling Ellie the truth. It would completely weaken the events of Part 1, undermined his character, and ruined that game's ending. So, Joel could not change, develop or grow in Part 2, as Part 1's entire ending was determined by the fact that he wasn't going to change and remain true to himself as a character. This is why Ellie in Part 2 has to find the truth for herself, and all she does is make Joel admit it by force.
Just say it.
This way, Joel isn't undermined as a character. Really, to keep Joel relevant in the story, you could only present a scenario where he is asked to make the same choice again, and all you would get is the same answer. So I'm glad they didn't just rehash it. I was going to talk about the flashbacks later. However, the first 2 flashbacks with Ellie seem relevant to this point, so I'm just going to quickly mention them there now. See, they're literally just repeats of previous established character moments.
Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
They were useless. Maybe if you just would have given them more time, they could have figured something out.
There was no cure.
Both flashbacks contain some underlying subtext that seems to point out the fact that all they're doing is repeating old ideas.
Is there something else you'd like to rehash?
What are you doing? What if there's like 2 bloaters back there?
It'll be fine.
Almost as if the writers are saying, we're just rehashing the same stuff again. Is that what you want in your sequel?
Actually, yeah. But a different one. See, there's a sequel. It wasn't as good.
Anyway, back to the point at hand. Lastly, Ellie finding out the truth was the last thing Joel could offer as a character. This is why I think the developers thought it would be okay to kill Joel off early, as the flashbacks coupled with the revelation scene is more than enough to indulge fans of the first game and bring his character to a close, as Joel's purpose as a character was done after that point anyway. So Joel, the protagonist of the first game, is used as a catalyst to make the entire experience worth seeing to the end, which is another reason to call it Part 2. It's also the reason why Joel's early death, the game's revenge narrative, and the flashbacks work so well together, constantly having the player question why Ellie is going through with this. Initially you might think Ellie is seeking her revenge because Joel was practically her father. Then it's revealed that she knew about the cure the whole time, making you wonder why she is trying so hard to avenge his death. Only in the final scenes of the game is it revealed that Ellie and Joel finally started to make amends, only for Joel to be killed soon after. Ellie risks life and limb on a suicide mission to avenge Joel, a man that ended humanity's chances at a prosperous future, destroying Ellie's life purpose in the process. So why? Why is Ellie going through all this? That's the question the entire story is built around exploring. See, despite a huge focus on Abby and revenge, at the core of the story, it's still a continuation of Joel and Ellie's relationship. It's why I think calling this game a hollow revenge story is an oversimplification and undersells the experience, but we'll get to that later. No doubt his death is completely unsatisfying, but in that way it's very genuine. Joel, a ruthless and brutal man, meets a very cruel and sadistic end. There's a poetic irony to the whole thing that draws you emotionally into the central theme of the story. Say what you want about his death and how it was achieved, but you cannot deny it didn't lack purpose in the story. It's the crutch that the entire narrative is built around. Moving on. Spurred on by what happened, Ellie and Dina make their way to Seattle after Tommy, with the purpose of getting revenge on the entire group, most importantly Abby, and this is where the true game begins. Now if I talk about every moment in the game, I'll be here all day, so I'm going to start talking about parts in a more general sense. On the surface, the core of the gameplay is very similar to Part 1, the core being a stealth game mixed with a third person shooter. Backing this up is a bunch of survival horror elements thrown into the mix. The whole scavenging for supplies, resource management and the like. The game cycling between these scenarios throughout: stealth, combat, crafting and scavenging. with flashbacks and one-off sequences used to break up the monotony. Finally, travelling through quiet areas in between, and this is used to tie all the gameplay scenarios together. Part 1's gameplay loop worked as intended on a basic level, which was satisfying in its own way, but it was incredibly simple. Now don't get me wrong, its simplicity isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just meant the original often relied on questionable enemy AI and its scripted set pieces to keep its gameplay interesting, rather than expanding on its core mechanics as the game progressed. By the time you finished the summer chapter, you'd seen everything the game had to offer from a gameplay mechanics standpoint. It then used one-off set pieces to help make sure its gameplay didn't get stale. Now part 2 can do this as well to avoid tedium, the sniper sequence with Tommy being a great example. The game using this tightly controlled situation to make things interesting, rather than letting the core gameplay do the work. The difference is part 2 is introducing new stuff right up until the end. Albeit, most of it is just old stuff reworked to seem new. The point still stands. New and reworked enemy types. This mixed with staggering the training manuals throughout the game that unlocks new abilities and craftable items, means there is always a steady stream of new stuff to keep the player engaged. Now while part 2 is still using set pieces to break up the monotony, it is more willing to let its core gameplay do the work by creating unique gameplay moments. In part 1, monotony never really set into the core gameplay loop, probably because it all felt original, and the game struck a great balance between its states of play. The game was short too, well at least in comparison to the sequel, meaning the gameplay didn't wear out its welcome. This is even more impressive when you consider the time it came out, as make no mistake, part 1 is a zombie game at its core, which had oversaturated the market at the time. But its gameplay and story succeeded because it brought enough of its own ideas to the genre to create something unique. Part 2 doesn't have the luxury of complete originality this time. Now, with it being a much longer game, Part 2 relies much more on its open environments and its new mechanics to keep its gameplay fresh. All of Part 1's previous mechanics have been reworked or built upon in some way, and there's a steady stream of unique gameplay scenarios to keep the player guessing. Now, while not as pushed as far as I would like, by keeping it that way, the game feels like a natural extension of Part 1. Or to put it another way, if Part 1 and Part 2 was somehow merged together and was one big long game, apart from a noticeable jump in graphics and AI behaviour a third of the way through, it would feel like a constant introduction of new mechanics and ideas all the way to the end. If we look at the game this way, this is where the tutorials of Part 2, not to mention the pace haltering parts when you switch over to Abby, really hurt it, bogging down the entire experience. It's the myriad of fixes and gameplay tweaks that really place the game above its predecessor. I'd be lying if I didn't say player fatigue doesn't set in at times, but some of that I'd argue is story related. Overall, the larger sense of player freedom, new enemies and mechanics, matched with the more unique situations than the first, really helped carry the game to the end. Stealth has some of the simplest, but possibly leading to some of the biggest changes in the game. The obvious is the sheer amount of enemies in each area. Not only are areas bigger than Part 1, but the enemy count has been increased to match, reinforcing the use of stealth. This often means encounters are much longer as well. In order to compensate for this, there's a very generous checkpoint system in place here. Now, Part 2 isn't an overly tough game, even on the harder difficulties. But I'm not a fan of games making things overly easy just to appease everyone, especially a grim game like Part 2, where the challenge seems like it should be baked into the experience. No one's looking at the situations Ellie puts herself in and thinking this should be easy. Suffice it to say, encounters can be very drawn out, with stealth being very slow paced. This combined with the increased enemy count means if you're spotted, you can be killed swiftly, even on the easier difficulties. So, the checkpoints, while being exploitable, help reduce player fatigue in the long run. Now, I'm not a fan of playing huge chunks of gameplay repeatedly. Even still, there's more than enough difficulty options, matched with the quick death animations and reload times, that its checkpoint system could have been somewhat stricter. The hearing mode is back, with significant changes. In Part 1, the hearing mode was far too abusable, and took the tension out of most encounters, since you always had a crystal clear picture of where the enemies are in any given area. It had always struck me as strange that Joel seemed to have better hearing than the clickers. Maybe echolocation isn't all it's cracked up to be. Thankfully in part 2, the hearing mode has been significantly toned down. In a clever little move, instead of giving you a clear white discernible silhouette at all times, it now depends how close you are to an enemy, and that will display how much clarity you'll get. The ability's now got a very short range. Matched with the blurry silhouette makes it hard to spot and attain which way the enemy is facing, helping retain some of the tension and the difficulty with the enemy encounters. And if the enemy stays still and quiet, they won't show up at all, meaning your vision is just as important. Combined with the bigger and more open environments, even when it's fully upgraded, the hearing mode is much less abusable, but far less useful as a result. Overall, that's a good thing in my opinion. The player can now go prone, being able to crawl along the ground, and this works in tandem with the new tall grass they've introduced, which you can now hide in. Honestly, when I saw that they introduced tall grass into the game, I rolled my eyes a little, but there's much more nuance to hiding in it than other games with a similar mechanic. Now, it's a little too easy to regain stealth by diving into it after a botched attempt, but enemies can still spot you from relatively far away, rather than the all or nothing affair like in most other titles. At the very least, it gives the player more options, suits the world, and makes the environments more interesting to traverse. Speaking of environments, the level design is also worth commending. Most spaces are incredibly open. They managed to change it up from part 1 with more of an emphasis on verticality in their design, helping create a different experience from the encounters of its predecessor, which Ellie's simple addition of a jump button can help take advantage of. Although the jump ability in general doesn't get near enough use as it probably should. It's perhaps a good thing in retrospect, as Naughty Dog should leave the hopping around and platforming to the Uncharted series. As impressive as part 1's levels were, they've been completely outdone in the sequel. The semi-open world present in Day 1 alone outdoes anything the best chunks of part 1 had to offer. It's a huge open space, and the majority of it is optional. Just to come back to Joel's death for a sec, after that tragic event, we go through a melancholic tour of Joel's home and his belongings. Coming after such a big moment, it's understandable the game doesn't rush into a big set piece. His house acts as a nice buffer after the intensity of his death. This section works to bring the tone down for a moment and settle. After this, there's another linear part with Dina, as the game eases the player into some more minor mechanics. It's mostly quiet, when nothing that eventful happens. The game slowly begins to dial the tone back up. How constrained everything has been up to now, the player needed room to stretch their legs at this point. Thankfully, the game delivers at the perfect time. The reveal of the open world is nothing short of breathtaking. And it isn't just visually vast, there's also tons to explore. There's a shotgun locked in a bank vault to find, some platforming to a hidden training manual, not to mention a bunch of optional conversations, explorable locations and encounters. Most importantly, it all happens at your own pace, with almost no interruptions from the game. The exception is a cutscene in a music shop, and even then, it's optional.
I'll be coming for you, okay? Take on me.
It might be the longest stretch of uninterrupted gameplay in the whole experience, and relies on the player's own agency to make progress. The area emphasises the best experiences that Part 2 is at creating, that it's astounding the game doesn't repeat it. In the age of shallow open worlds, I think Naughty Dog didn't want to overstep here. Last of Us was never an open world game, nor do I want it to be. But by just how successful they were with this area, a similar sequence like this when you played as Abby would have been a good compromise here. Even still, the rest of the game's environments are nothing to slouch at either. Naughty Dog's ability to strike a great balance between linearity and openness means spaces always feel unrestricted, while having enough room to breathe and explore. You always have a reasonable idea of where to go next. Clever lighting and design helps draw the player in a certain direction, which in fairness is often just forward. Enemy encounters can now take place over such a wide open space that even if you are spotted and die in one direction, there are many more paths you can take, helping reduce fatigue in the long run, as encounters can be quite lengthy. Explorable shops and buildings tend to loop around or back on themselves, putting you in the right direction. So with the exception of heading backwards, you're often rewarded from deviating from the main path. You're also never in one area for too long, giving the game a sense of forward momentum. While searching for materials, you'll be picking up scrap and pills for upgrading your gear and character respectfully. While the character upgrades are much more varied than last time, thanks to your expanded gear and moveset, the gun upgrade system hasn't changed much at all. There's still upgrade tables scattered around the world, and their animations from when you're swapping out parts are nice. It's just a bit lackluster in comparison to the rest of the game. There is nothing inherently wrong with the upgrade system, and I think the game would be worse off without it. But there's similar improvements to the guns in the last game, and it lacks much depth. The expanded arsenal, combined with the upgrade system to your guns and pills for your character, means by the end you'll be making mincemeat of most enemies. Weapon sway will almost be non-existent in the late game for both campaigns, meaning encounters can turn into a cover shooter at times, something I believe the game strives against evolving into. The game is built around a cat and mouse design where firefights should be avoided if possible, and staying in a firefight should be a last resort. Don't get me wrong, the AI is competent enough to make sure it never goes that far, as they always attempt to flank the player from cover. However, by the end of the game you'll be feeling like a one-man army. Now arguably with the exception to the last stretch of the game in Santa Barbara, it doesn't seem like it follows the core design. The game's greatest strength comes from its emphasis on survival. High enemy counts, quick deaths, the use of stealth, limited resources, and scavenging for supplies. All these aspects play into this design mantra. Therefore, the two boss fights, the bout with the Rat King and the stealth fight against Ellie, both feel appropriate for the title, despite the fact they can be very frustrating for the player, as they both put the player in a scenario with such disadvantages, that it overall comes off like you survived rather than you defeated. This is the core that the entire gameplay system is built around. The player should always be feeling on the back foot in a fight, regardless of the difficulty setting. Now, having the encounter shift towards the player's advantage later through the upgrades and new gear isn't an outright bad thing. In fact, it can lend a new sense to a fight, something I believe the Santa Barbara section where Ellie achieves. Still, I think part 2 oversteps here by the end, as even the game's best efforts to up the challenge, such as the armoured enemies in the last section, it never compensated enough for all my upgrades and gear, especially when you can now craft certain ammo types. A stress mechanic like MGS4, meaning the longer the encounters went on, the worse your aim would be, seems like a good compromise here, meaning players with the best aim would want to return to stealth eventually, while not undermining the core gameplay. A little further on, we're introduced to a new type of infected. Swarmers are new to this game. Probably the best way to describe them is an infected somewhere past the clicker, but not long enough to be a bloater. I wish they were a little more out there in terms of design and abilities. However, they match the aesthetics of the infected perfectly, slotting right into the world with ease, and I'd argue that's more important. It's something new, while feeling consistent with the world, which is a tough balancing act to get right. They've got some toughness of a bloater, but also some of the speed of a clicker. Most importantly, they can't be stealth killed, making them a formidable enemy. With the clicker's screech ability, they work as a tough enemy encounter, and as a nice stealth challenge. I've got to give props to when and where they're introduced. The infected had just lost their edge when you entered the underground, and introducing a new enemy in the dark really helps shake up the pattern the game was falling into. The game seems to have a knack for introducing the right thing at the right time to break up the formula. When I had enough upgrades and tools, I was stealth killing rooms of enemies without restraint. This is when I felt the game's repetition starting to creep in. That's when they introduced the dogs, which can track down your scent, meaning you constantly have to be on the move in order to avoid detection, which had me completely readjusting my tactics. Now, it's far too easy just to kill the owner with the silenced pistol, because the dog will stay put at the body, so ultimately they lose their edge. The dog barking, allotting the attention of other guards would overcome this tactic. So, although they need some reworking, the dogs are a worthwhile inclusion, just for their initial threat and stealth. A much better introduction is the completely reworked stalker enemies. A runner that's halfway towards a clicker.
Stalkers.
You'd be forgiven for forgetting the stalkers were in the first game, as there was very few of them, and they weren't that interesting. Overall they lacked a clear design, and just equated to a slightly tougher runner enemy. In part 2, they're a wholly original encounter. Unlike anything else in the game, stalkers never attack head on, and instead hide and attempt to flank the player. They're incredibly hard to track on the hearing mode. Dashing at the player at the very last second makes them very hard to hit or dodge. The paranoia this creates in any scenario is nothing short of genius. Honestly, they kinda work like a real-time jump scare, but it has the benefit of bringing some much needed horror back into the experience. Knowing one is in the area will have you spinning the camera in circles trying to catch one from sneaking up on you. The enemies blew my mind when I first encountered them. Taking place in a huge open office with a dozen in the area, hearing them scurry around like rats in the background in fear one would grab me, it became one of the most memorable parts of the game. They eventually go from solo encounters to mixed with other infected later, and their small inclusion helps bring some much needed variety back to the infected encounters. The infected come together in sort of a spectrum that I would call XYZ design, as the infected work in tandem with each other. Each is built to test one aspect of the player's awareness. Runners make sure you stay out of sight, clickers make sure you stay quiet, and stalkers constantly having you checking the corners in front and behind you. Each are simple mechanically on the surface, but put together they create a hive mind like system to detect and corner the player. It's this synergy between infected that all comes together into something greater than the sum of its parts. Despite this, the infected variants are used with constant restraint with one another. Rarely will you see clickers, runners and stalkers in the one scenario, as the infected variants work as a way to raise or lower the difficulty in a less artificial way than most other games. It's not about shoving a bunch of infected into an area to make it hard, it's about putting the right infected in the right place to create a unique challenge for the player. That's why I think the infected are a cut above any of the other countless other zombie type enemies out there. Feeling like something new and unique, despite being so similar to a typical zombie. When you reach the theatre with Dina, the game's structure comes into focus. While part 1 was a relatively short game, taking place over a long span of time, 4 seasons equating to a year, part 2 is a very long game, taking place over a very short space of time, a 3-day cycle. It's not exactly clever, but I'm glad the developers didn't just repeat what they did in the last game, and the story has a bit more urgency because of it, with each day's peaks and valleys, rather than the slow burn of the original climaxing at the end. Now, neither one is inherently better than the other, they're just different. It's here when Dina reveals she's pregnant with Jesse's baby.
I think I'm pregnant.
So this is probably the best time to talk about them. Mostly I'll be referring to Dina, as she's more important. But Jesse suffers from a lot of the same problems here. There's nothing inherently wrong with Dina as a character. Although when I realised she was Jewish, bisexual and comes from an immigrant family, I couldn't help but think they were trying to tick too many boxes with one character. But those are more so observations and aren't really negatives against her. Her true problem comes from the fact that she can't hold a candle to the narrative weight put behind Ellie in the first game. In fairness, Ellie had the whole game's narrative focused on her in the first one, while Dina here in part 2 is just a side character, albeit a very important one. But even Tess from part 1, who got a lot less screen time in comparison to Dina, seemed to have a lot more going on than that game was showing. Her history with Joel and what they'd done to survive all these years were all hinted at. Dina and Ellie don't really have that, or at least not to the same extent. In other words, part 2's companions can't live up to the relationship that Joel and Ellie had formed together in part 1. something I believe the conversations in the flashbacks only go to emphasise. In fairness to part 2, it doesn't even try to compete. Her and Jesse are not written to be very deep characters. Instead, the game is content with just having them being close to Ellie. We know that they really care about her, but that's the extent of it. Obviously the game wants us to like and care about them, while still making sure that Ellie gets centre stage. Ultimately, their biggest problem comes from the fact that none of them have agency in the plot. Dina and Jesse are just plodding along to the same goal for no discernible reason. The fact of the matter is, it's Ellie's revenge plot. She's the one who has the will to risk life and limb, except in the circumstances of what amounts to a suicide mission in Seattle. Only her and Tommy have the necessary motivation to see it through till the end. Dina is just tagging along for the ride. I know she probably loves Ellie, and grief is a great way to bring people together. I just find it hard to believe that she's willing to do all this, as their relationship only became romantic the same day Joel dies. I'll admit, later Dina being with Jesse's baby, just to have Jesse show up, amounts to a nice bit of melodrama, and certainly adds to the stakes, but that's all it amounts to. The core of the narrative would still be there without them. With all that being said, I wouldn't remove Dina or Jesse from the game, or even trim their inclusion in the plot, as it pays off narratively at multiple points, especially in the ending. Firstly, just from a simple gameplay perspective, having an AI companion was at the core of part 1, so it'd be strange not to have one in part 2, even without it being Joel. Having a companion gives Ellie someone to talk to, letting us in on her feelings about the situation. Now, Ellie's diary can supplement this somewhat, and there's something to be said about a character that rarely speaks, especially in a revenge tale. But it's still a worthwhile inclusion having Dina and Jesse, just so they can interact with Ellie. Although it's not perfect. It can be a little strange to have Ellie and Dina joke around so soon in the player's eyes after Joel's death. But since it's a mostly depressing game the rest of the way through, a little levity here isn't a bad thing, especially after a major character death. Secondly, they act as a helpful in-game convenience to tell Ellie what to do and where to go. And they're subtle buffers to ramp up or down the gameplay difficulty, adding to the challenge for when you strike out on your own, or making encounters easier by having them providing you with support. Lastly, narratively the relationship pays off multiple times. When Abby is about to kill Ellie, Dina's rescue works so well and is unexpected, as after you find out she is pregnant, her character really falls into the background. As such, if you're anything like me, after playing 10 hours of Abby, you probably forgot about her. The fact that Ellie uses the same reason that Owen used to get Abby to stop herself from killing Dina is incredibly grim. Later at the farm with Dina, Ellie and the baby, we get a glimpse of what life could have been like for Ellie if she had let it be. It's one of the few parts of levity in the game. But most importantly, Dina's inclusion pays off at the very end, when Ellie returns to a hollow, empty house after completely destroying her life. None of these would have been possible without Dina's inclusion in the narrative. So maybe they're not the best characters, but they're far better AI companions. Part 1 suffered from companions making ludicrous amounts of noise, bumping into the infected, and being clearly visible by both infected and human enemies. Yet the game's enemies would just ignore them. Obviously this was done so the companion's AI rightfully wouldn't keep getting you spotted, causing the player needless frustration. However, the second it happened, your immersion was shattered. Look, credit to the game for making Ellie not feel like a burden to the player, but there is a certain cheapness to how they achieved it. For example, she had no health bar, and enemies would largely ignore her. To be fair, Ellie could be grabbed, but it was mostly scripted, and only happened after you entered combat. Basically, your companion felt like she didn't exist in the game world, completely sucking you out of the experience. And this was a game where Ellie, your AI companion, is one of the core aspects of the game. Thankfully, in part 2, most of these issues have been addressed. Your companion's ability in combat has been greatly increased, making combat and stealth encounters easier. They can still call out traps, and I'll tell you about off-screen enemies, whispering and shouting when appropriate.
Stalkers! Get ahead!
The biggest change comes from the fact that enemies can now spot your companion, making them a tangible element in the world.
Jesus!
Unlike Ellie in Part 1, who only existed when the game decided it was necessary. In Part 2, they've solved the needless frustration of your companion being spotted by the fact that the AI companion and enemies now work in tandem with each other, where the game will attempt to make sure that the two never come in direct contact with each other. Basically, the game's AI is making sure your companion never comes into the enemy's line of sight. And it works for the most part. Enemies can still notice your companion and sometimes not react, almost to a comical degree.
We're all clear.
But it's a far less frequent occurrence than it was in Part 1. Although this behaviour comes with some downsides of its own. In order to avoid detection, your companion might inadvertently block your path, either boxing you in or not allowing you to go around the corner, possibly getting you spotted in the process. This creates a whole new frustration of its own. So neither game has it far from perfect. Therefore, it then becomes a trade-off between the immersion-shattering convenience of Part 1 or having a tangible companion leading to some frustration of Part 2. But for me, there's no debate. Part 2's sacrifice of convenience for a more immersive game is categorically the superior version of the two. Talking about AI, human enemies have been largely fixed in Part 2. In Part 1, the bandits could be quite clever, trying to flank Joel, using their environment to their advantage, often running away and hiding if things weren't going their way, and vice versa. Although it wasn't perfect by any means, enemies would often get confused frequently, presenting themselves to Joel for an easy kill. Sometimes enemies would rush Joel in this awkward walk that could only be described as broken. They'd throw Molotovs into walls, killing themselves, and in the Left Behind DLC, the AI bandits couldn't handle the player and the infected in the same space together. In Part 2, all of these issues have been addressed in some way. Enemies can still get confused, but it's a far rarer occurrence now. It's the plethora of little touches and small additions they've added that really improves the whole experience. Enemies will now communicate with each other, often referring to each other by name. Enemies will now notice a squad member missing and investigate. They'll shout their squad mate's name if they notice you've killed them. When the enemies noticed my gun was out of bullets and began to rush me while I was panicking to switch weapons, I was truly impressed.
She's out!
The fact that enemies will randomly check behind them is such an obvious addition, and adds another layer of believability to the encounters. Overall, it really changes how stealth is played, but they don't do it too often as not to become overly frustrating. There's also a little more variety this time round. The WLF and the Scars can be quite distinct from each other, with Scars frequently carrying melee weapons and bows instead of conventional firearms. The Scars communicate with whistles. And as the game went on, I was surprised on how much I picked up on what the different whistles meant. My favourite touch is the Scars will resort back to shouting to each other when things get desperate enough.
There's a wolf here! In that...
With exception to the scripted sequences, there were very few forced combat encounters. And with the new tools and actions the player can take, matched with the more open environments, player agency and freedom might be the highest ever seen for a linear game type like The Last of Us. All these elements work so incredibly well together that Part 2 becomes a very engrossing experience at times. Playing alone with just Ellie and Abby, scavenging with no interruptions, can literally make you forget you're playing a video game. Puzzles are thankfully pushed a little further this time. In Part 1, getting Ellie to jump on pallets, moving dumpsters, planks and ladders All just boil down to find the desired object nearby, and there you go, puzzle complete. The word puzzle is being stretched here. The closest thing we got to a brain teaser in part 1 is the ladder puzzle near the end, and it might catch you off guard by the fact that it requires more thought than any other thing in the game. Even then, I can't see it stumping the player for more than 30 seconds. Now, nothing in part 2 is what I would call complex, but making most of the puzzles optional means they can at least require some thought on the part of the player. My favourite optional thing in part 1 was the 2 saves that could be opened for extra gear. There was nothing complicated about them. Just find a note nearby with the combination number and you got rewarded with some extra supplies. Despite being simple, they were a nice distraction from the main game and rewarded thorough exploration of an area. In part 2, the number of saves has been greatly increased, and while it's still find a note with the code on it, some try a little harder than that, and it's a change I thoroughly enjoyed. And I extend this enjoyment to all the optional parts in the game, such as the new manuals, notes, collectibles and trinkets. Surprisingly, the bloater enemy is introduced in a flashback with Ellie and Joel. The bloater was the closest thing to a boss type enemy part 1 had to offer, so it only seemed appropriate to have Joel and Ellie fight one together. It's also a subtle way to show how much Ellie has grown and learned since that encounter, when Ellie later in the game takes one down by herself without Joel's help. I'm not a fan of how this fight ends in a scripted kill sequence, but since it's a flashback and none after this must end this way, I'm okay with it. They somehow made the bloater more imposing than part 1. It can now tear through the environment, and I'd be surprised if a player wasn't caught off guard the first time it happens. They are tougher and more formidable than they were in the first game, and thankfully they're handled with restraint. The game never repeating the same scenario twice, while getting more difficult with each encounter. First you fight one with Joel helping you in a flashback, then by yourself as Ellie, finally as Abby with clickers and other infected thrown into the mix. It's even possible to sneak past this one, and I'm glad they gave the player the option, as fighting this one with all the infected in the area can be quite difficult. The best thing about this flashback is the conversation Ellie and Joel have at the end. Ellie is showing that she has doubts about the cure story, but Joel refuses to budge on the matter. The ending of the last game implied Joel would have to tell this immunity lie to Ellie for the rest of their time on Earth together. So I'm glad in the sequel we actually get to see Joel play out that lie in front of us. And Ellie questioning it leads nicely into the next flashback in the hospital. Speaking of flashbacks, we get multiple ones for both Ellie and Abby. With exception to the bloater one, none of them contain combat. So, they're a nice reprieve from the very heavy combat encounter main game. This video is long enough as it is, so I'm not going to go through them all. The best one is when Joel and Ellie visit the museum on her birthday. It contrasts well in a very overall grim experience, by being the only real comforting moment in the game, probably capturing the best quiet moments part 1 had to offer. Most people I believe see this flashback as the game they were missing out on, the sequel they should have got, so to speak. However, I see it another way. I genuinely believe Ellie is a shell of her former self since the hospital. Just look at the ending scenes of part 1 with Joel. She seems completely dejected from the world. I believe Joel, since stopping the vaccine, has been trying non-stop to get Ellie to regain some of her former spark, with various states of success. Teaching her guitar and allowing her to go on patrol are some good examples.
Most of the new recruits
Look,
who've...
you think you're ready. I trust you.
Okay. Thanks.
See, I think we're watching the last time Ellie has been truly happy since being taken from the hospital bed. Now, before I talk about Abby's flashbacks, let me explain how we get there. Moving on, Ellie after dispatching most of Abby's crew. Her narrative culminates at the theatre where she finally encounters Abby. Jesse is killed, and Tommy presumably so. Now Ellie is caught in an incredibly compromised position. Not to mention, after having all of her companions killed, Abby looks as if she won't be reasoned with, and we're left on an incredibly tense moment where Ellie looks done for. This is where we cut to the worst flashback as we take control of Abby. I've nothing inherently against Abby as a character. It's obvious the game wants us to empathise with Abby almost immediately. But this flashback had me verbally laughing out loud, by the way it panders to the audience in order to make us feel for her. It's not nuanced or clever. Her dad is being presented as nothing short of than a saint, and this is 20 years into an apocalypse where people will do anything to survive. It's so heavy-handed with its messaging, with him helping save a trapped zebra, that it could only be described as tactless and a clumsy piece of storytelling. Abby's other flashbacks are not bad per se. Other than to be consistent with Ellie, I don't believe they're really necessary. Presumably they wanted to give Abby about the same amount of screen time as Ellie, flashbacks and all. Despite this, I don't really think they achieve much. Sure, they set up the aquarium as an important location, but her and Owen's relationship is done better through their interactions with each other. And the flashbacks with Owen just overtly tell us what we should already know by now. The opening scene with Abby and Owen as they scope out Jackson in the snow does such a good job of setting up their relationship that I really don't think it's essential we have that much time dedicated to it in the flashbacks. Anyway, after the zebra flashback is when we switch over to Abby, and the game essentially begins anew. Now we play her campaign over the 3-day cycle. Before I get into some of the problems caused by this, let me give you the reason why the game is designed this way. Playing as multiple characters in video games sounds good in practice, be it for just the simple reason of variety, but often cutting between playable characters can often be more detrimental than the variety it creates. How can we relate to one protagonist when we're constantly cutting away from them? Or to put it another way, your character's primary concern should also be the player's primary concern. Video games do this by placing you accurately in their shoes, and in order to make this happen, we need to experience everything your protagonist goes through over the course of the story. Part 1 pulled off playing as Ellie in the winter chapter because Joel was out of commission at the time. Still, the game was clever enough to put us in Joel's shoes when Ellie went missing, so we can empathise with him in that scenario. This is why putting focus on just a singular character is one of video games' greatest strengths, as it allows us to spend countless hours working towards the same goal as the protagonist. As such, we empathise and relate with them on a level that really only a video game could achieve. Having an ensemble cast can work in a film, but cutting to a different protagonist throughout a game's narrative only undermines the other story, by the simple fact of you're taking focus away from one to tell another. It also means a huge amount of time is used setting up new characters and different story arcs, often cut into the middle of a video game, adding to the amount of time wasted on other pursuits, rather than the main goal of every video game, playing it. Now this is the very thing Part 2 is guilty of, although it manages to avoid most of the snags by front-loading all of Abby's story into the second half of the game, when the climax of Ellie's tale has already been reached. As such, it doesn't detract from Ellie up to then, or to put it another way, neither story bogs down the other, as they both feel separate from each other. Both Ellie and Abby's paths mostly work, because they're told in isolation from each other. If they cut between the two stories like they did in the game's opening, it would be hard to relate to either one of them, since you probably got invested in one story over the other, having the player constantly wanting to play as their favourite character. The way Part 2 does it means you get the best of both worlds, telling two narratives without losing focus on either, by not constantly swapping back and forth. Telling Ellie all the way up to a possible ending means we aren't waiting to play as Ellie, instead we are waiting to catch up with it as Abby, giving her plot some agency. It also has the benefit of showing us what both characters are focused on. Ellie's campaign is a non-stop pursuit to track down Abby and her group. It's Ellie's sole focus and it's all she cares about. While, when you play as Abby, Ellie is almost a non-entity until the end. Abby has completely put the whole thing behind her, and now she is focused on other pursuits. Now, let's get to the problems. After reaching the climax with Ellie, we're left on an almost 10-hour cliffhanger as we play as Abby. But this in and of itself isn't inherently the problem. In fact, as I've said, it brings some agency to Abby's campaign in the beginning. Since she got her lifelong revenge on Joel, There's nothing pushing her or the player along at this point when we start her campaign. Cutting at the climax means the player controlling Abby has an underlying motivation to see her story through to the end, just to find out what happens to Ellie in the theatre. And eventually, after enough time has passed, you'll probably get invested in Abby's plot. So overall, it's effective. Although doing it this way hasn't gone unpunished. The main one being, it kills the pacing, as we waste time setting up Abby. There's a good 2 hours where we're back on the reins, with linear walking segments mixed with scripted combat encounters, as we set up Abby, her companions, and the WLF, not to mention Isaac and his planned attack on Haven. Essentially, we're back to walking and talking for another huge chunk of the game, and we've been through all this with Ellie, but now it's filling up the middle, where you'd expect the player to be in more control of the pace, not back in the game's hands. You could argue the game is overly long, and suffers from a padded ending, and while I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, I personally think it's this padded out middle that really brings the whole experience down, as it brings the pace down to an absolute crawl. Eventually it picks up again when Abby goes in search of Owen, but there's another few hours until we get there. Halting the pace after such a big moment isn't the problem here. For example, bringing the pace to a sudden halt after we fight Ellie as Abby walks, because the game had built up to this same climax twice at this point. Therefore, we need some time to cool off, and experiencing a quiet moment with Dina at the farm achieves that. It acts as a nice buffer, before eventually building back up towards the final stretch of the game. Cutting from the climax as Ellie to begin a mostly uneventful first few hours of Abby's campaign seems like a huge misstep. Sure, it's needed to set up Abby as a character, but it's a real mess in terms of where it's placed in the game, and feels like a slog to get through early on. If the idea is to make us like Abby, it really struggles at best in the beginning. Thankfully, her campaign really redeems itself much later. Talking about Abby herself, now, I don't want to get into a whole debate over this, but Abby's look as a character is a very frustrating one for me. I personally think her hulking arms make her look ridiculous for the setting. Although I'd be lying if I didn't say it doesn't pay off at multiple points. It's clear the idea was to turn her into a Terminator type character, with her only sole focus on avenging her father's death, completely changing her body and mind in order to achieve it, and her look accomplishes that, even if I think it's a bit ridiculous. Furthermore, when we get to the end, Abby being completely unrecognisable pays off in spades, especially in the fight with her, and it wouldn't be nearly as effective without her former physical appearance to contrast against. Nonetheless, we're talking about a world where survival is the top priority, and while being fit and in shape seems like a must, spending precious hours lifting weights every day seems like a huge waste of time. Keep in mind we're talking about the WLF group, who's willing to put Mel, a heavily pregnant woman, on the front lines. Maybe they should dismantle the gym and put those people to work instead. Speaking of Mel, she's pretty inconsequential as a character, mostly forgettable. Merely a reminder that Abby's relationship never worked out with Owen, and as a narrative tool for when Ellie stabs her, just to make Ellie question her own morality. But Mel's character is so incredibly inept that it's hard not to talk about her. They managed to craft one of the most judgmental characters that I've ever seen. Mel is so full of herself, she can't see her own contradictions staring at her in the face. She continually gives Owen and Abby a hard time for being selfish, putting themselves and others at risk, while she's constantly making stupid decisions, putting her own life while risking the baby at the same time.
One advantage of being pregnant: low center of gravity. I'll take your word for it.
When she gives Abby a telling off in the aquarium for being selfish, it was so forced to make us feel for Abby again that it just came off as comically bad. Therefore, I couldn't help but mention it. I believe her character was intentionally meant to be dislikable, so the player would feel bad for Owen and Abby not working out. It works. It works so well that her character is nothing short of ridiculous. It might be the biggest stain character-wise I'd put on the game's narrative.
You're a piece of shit, Abby.
Anyway, back to playing as Abby. Starting our campaign felt like one step forward, 2 steps backwards in its approach, but it eventually picks up, Thankfully, there's been a real effort to differentiate the two campaigns. Abby's different upgrade parts, new unlockable abilities and craftable items, matched with her different arsenal of weapons, means it doesn't feel like you're starting the game from scratch. There was a big effort to make Ellie and Abby's campaigns play different as well, while not limiting the player or going against the core mechanics. Ellie is mostly stealth focused, shifting towards action in the later chapters. Abby's plays out the same way, but in reverse, focusing on action at the beginning, with stealth only being encouraged later. This gives the player a slightly similar, but slightly different experience. And it's not just surface level differences here. All depending on the difficulty here, Ellie can only take a few hits. That's not counting the multiple enemies that can one-shot you. While Abby can take significantly more punishment, and her shivs can block her from being killed instantly. Now, Ellie can get an expensive upgrade to do the same, but even then, it will only leave you on a sliver of health. Ellie's weapons account for one long-range rifle and the rest being short-range. This is with exception to the silent submachine gun, but the game saves that for the last chapter. Most of her items are traps or distractions. They all work well to give you enough time to get out of combat. While Abby gets the assault rifle instantly, and her guns tend to focus on the mid-range. Abby's takedowns are incredibly slow, and her shivs breaks with use, while Ellie's switchblade is much faster, and means stealth isn't just a usable resource. Although there is something to be said for Abby's satisfying neck crack she performs. Ellie's early upgrade parts encourage stealth tactics, such as quick kills, the silencer, and being able to move faster on the ground. While Abby has pipe bombs, and she gets the endurance ability, allowing her to rush multiple enemies the more kills she gets. Even the character finisher differentiate from each other. Ellie are precise clean finishes, while Abby are over the top and brutal, absolutely wrecking the enemy. It is telling when Ellie gets the submachine gun at the end, while Abby gets a crossbow and flamethrower. Both their upgrade paths fall in line with this. Ellie having stealth upgrades in the early part while focusing on shooting and explosives in the late part. Abby again similar but in reverse, focusing on shooting and explosives in the early part and stealth in the later part. Once again, giving the player a slightly similar but slightly different experience. Both narratives differ in tone as well. While Ellie seems to be spiralling downwards, Abby seems to be on the up. You get the sense that trying to get revenge on Joel has been holding her life back. But now with that out of the way, she finally gains control of her own future. So their motives contrast well. Ellie slowly becomes more single-minded in her pursuit as the game progresses, ignoring Dina, Jesse and Tommy's welfare. She brutally beats Nora, despite her being dead anyway, while Abby becomes more open-minded, showing sympathy and helping former scars Yara and Lev. Her campaign does suffer from drawn-out segments, where very little happens, not to mention a bunch of bland characters that pad the whole thing out. But I have to admit, by the time I got to the end, I was surprised how much Abby had won me over. Nowhere near to what the game probably wanted me to be, but enough to have me caring at least. It's helped by how little Ellie's narrative impacts Abby's, since they rarely overlap and its long length. By a certain point I'd forgot about Ellie and began to immerse myself in Abby's narrative. So it works, although the game does pull some cheap tricks along the way. The zebra flashback which I've mentioned is the obvious one, but also giving Abby a fear of heights, and then to have us as a player overcome it with her, just seemed like a lazy way to make us empathise with her. It seemed cheap, and was a way to make crossing the two buildings more interesting than it actually is. Although I did enjoy her banter with Lev here.
How you feeling?
Waiting on all that true strength.
Cold.
Cool.
What?
Never mind.
Speaking of Lev, her character is something I'm not so sure of. I've nothing against the game being more representative in theory. The idea of a character having an identity crisis is certainly an interesting concept, especially for a video game character. In this case, Lev is a girl who wants to be a boy. His group doesn't accept him for who he wants to be, so he gets himself banished when he decides to change his identity anyway. It's a little contrived to make it all work. The scars seem to have strict gender roles under certain circumstances, and I find it strange that people would care about your gender identity in a post-apocalyptic society. Fundamentally though, I'm okay with the idea behind it. My only problem is, that's all there is to his character. By the time we meet Lev, his sister and him have already accepted the change and the consequences. As such, his arc is finished. Now all he wants is his zealot mother to accept him. And sadly, there's not much else to him than that, especially when you contrast him against Ellie, who filled a similar role in the previous game. His group, including his mother, is now turned against him. It's tragic and to some extent relatable, sure, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it adds much of anything to the story or his character. The scars seem like religious zealots from the get-go. The reasons Lev and Yara are running from the group does nothing else but confirm that. As characters unto themselves, they're kind of bland, presumably because they were designed to make Abby change over the course of her campaign. Them themselves have already changed before they've met Abby, and as such, they give Abby a picture of what she can become if she lets her prejudice go, which ultimately makes Yara and Lev pretty cut and dry characters. However, it works on the whole to get Abby to change over the course of the game. At this point, you probably think I hated playing as Abby, but on the contrary, Abby has some of the best parts from both games. The descent from the top of the hotel to the ground floor was one of my favourite moments from both titles. The cramped and narrow spaces mixed with the high damaged enemies made for a brilliant test of your stealth and combat skills. Every flight you descended mixes up the enemy encounters, and putting the bloater at the end was a nice way to cap off the whole section. When I eventually reached the bottom, I remember thinking how the game was going to top that. To my surprise, the game somehow did with the hospital section next. Although short, it cranks the survival horror up to 11, culminating into what felt like one giant homage to Resident Evil. Unsettling notes, unlocking doors, restoring power and scavenging supplies, all in a very creepy location, with the player needing to defeat a giant mutated boss at the end and all. It was personally one of the game's peaks for me.
Am I gonna kill you?
The war on Haven is a great mix of stealth in the beginning into total chaos. The fact that there is no infected, and with the factions fighting each other, it separates itself from the rest of the game nicely. It also brings Abby full circle. She doesn't care about grudges anymore, and only wants her friends to leave this mess behind. Anyway, with Yara killed, Abby abandons the WLF to protect Lev, and eventually finds her former friends dead. Now we finally catch up with Ellie's campaign, which leads us back to the theatre. This kicks off a boss fight with Ellie. After Ellie's ruthlessness, killing her way through everyone up to this point, it seems only fair we get to experience the other side of that battle. Although not mechanically complex, Ellie's no pushover. I do enjoy the fact that Ellie will change up her strategy as the fight progresses, from hunting down Abby to later implementing stealth tactics, trying to make you fall into a trap. The best thing about this fight is the conflicting feelings. Controlling Abby having to hide and fight Ellie can be very frustrating, and thought-provoking as a result. See, the game's been trying to blur the lines between antagonist and protagonist by their contrasting campaigns. Earlier as Ellie, you've been probably killing the dogs with reckless abandon. If not, you're forced to kill one in the aquarium, only to play fetching games with the dogs as Abby. Another example would be, if you're like me, you wanted nothing else than to rip the head off that sniper in that well done lengthy set piece, only to realise in the last second that it was Tommy. It's a great touch that Tommy shows Ellie to attract the infected with gunfire in the flashback, then to use that same tactic against Abby during that section. But the blurred lines probably come through best in this boss fight, by the game having you literally fighting against your own protagonist with the supposed villain. Despite having a completely different story, the sequel builds on the same narrative question the last game finished on. In part 1, when Ellie is going to be sacrificed for the cure, Joel is asked the question, how far are you willing to go to get what you want? With the ending showing how far. Part 2 asks that same question, but instead it's at the forefront of the narrative from the beginning, with the brutal killing of Joel. This has Ellie asking herself that same question. Continuing that narrative question that the last game ended on helps bind the two stories nicely together. Once again, another reason you would call it part 2. Initially to create hate in the player of Abby and her group was plainly the developers' intentions. In fact, it worked so well to create hate in the player that I think it unintentionally caused people to never stop feeling that emotion throughout the entire experience. Meaning when they tried to subvert that feeling by having you play as Abby, although we are getting her perspective, she's almost irredeemable at that stage. I think the writers recognise this, so as the game puts Abby in a favourable light, they've already cast a huge shadow on Ellie's character. Hate is such a palpable feeling throughout the game that it's hard to see the game's true intentions. See, instead of avoiding what Joel did, the narrative tackles it head on from the get-go. Although it's great to be back in this world, seeing some of our beloved characters again, there is a hollow feeling to it all, undermining the entire thing, as we're watching all the characters live sort of a lie of a life, due to the actions taken by Joel in the ending of the last game. Really, the world should be in recovery and bright. I think before Joel's death, this is what the game was trying to trick us into believing. The gap starts with what seems like the happily ever after most players envisioned after the first game's ending. Life looks like it's never been so good. Playing snowball fights, young love blooming, and finding the time to get high. And there's still enough bad stuff to make you believe it's all real. Later, Joel's casual demeanour in what could be a very dangerous scenario could be the fault of him living this quiet, peaceful life for 4 years. You almost want to believe the lie, that life has worked out for all our beloved characters, despite all the bad stuff Joel's done. Instead, Joel's death shows us the truth and takes us back to reality. It demonstrates to us that the world is still in a state of decay, and the consequences of the previous game are coming back to haunt the characters. Part 2 indulges our need to find out what happens next, but just like in real life, the answers are often tragic and disheartening. His death causes this whole revenge tale. Ellie travels hundreds of miles, brutally murders dozens in a him or me scenario, including a pregnant woman, inadvertently causes Jesse to be killed and Tommy to be permanently injured. She gives up her life with Dina and finally loses her fingers. Also, she can avenge Joel, a man who ended humanity's future. The game hints at the many reasons Ellie might be going through with this, with all the flashbacks. But even right up until the end of the game, it never gives us a straight answer why. As a result, we can only assume Joel means a great deal to Ellie, despite everything he's done. Otherwise, why would she push herself so far? And she seems to only suffer more as the story unfolds. As such, I think we all want Ellie desperately to succeed, but at what cost? If Ellie's story arc in part 1 is about the loss of innocence, an innocent young girl is forced to do unthinkable things in order to survive, part 2 is only the continuation of that arc, and gets taken even further, becoming the loss of morality.
Christ. Is that your blood?
Part 2 is very much a tonal change from the first one. I mean, part 1 was a very grim game as well. Let's not forget the fate of Tess, Sam and Henry. But part 2 is a far gloomier game. In part 1, at least Joel achieves some happiness and relief by the end. In part 2, I don't think anyone does. This tonal change can also be seen in the visuals. Part 1 had much more saturated colours, with warmer tones, showing a world where nature was starting to make a comeback. It often looked more like a paradise, not a post-apocalypse. Now, while part 2 can have some stunning visuals, the open world segment being a great example, the saturation has been dialed back and is often a much darker and dirtier game from the first one, shifting towards the cooler tones, portraying a world in a state of decay. While part 1 had a sense of hope present in the world with all the wild animals, part 2 has a sense of hopelessness by the sheer lack of them. The only parts where the visuals match the first game, wild animals and all, is in the flashbacks, which is a very nice touch. You might be thinking I'm giving the game some undue praise here. So, before I go any further, I want to talk about a fundamental problem with the story. It relies too heavily on contrivance to make things happen. The person Abby just happens to run into first is Joel. Sure, it gets the plot moving, but talk about raising an eyebrow. Ellie leaving behind the map for Abby, with the home base blatantly marked on it, are just a few of the obvious ones. There are many, many more that I'm just not going to mention. You can make legitimate excuses for these problems, and I'll admit, some of them have more merit than others. But overall, the game suffers in this regard, at least when compared to its predecessor. But not because Part 1 didn't contain contrivances of its own. I'd be remiss not to mention the contrivance that Part 1's entire game is built from. In the original Last of Us, Tess and Joel track down Robert in an attempt to get their guns back. By performing a little torture on him, they find out he sold them to the Fireflies in order to repay a debt. So, left with no other options, they decide to track down a Firefly. The Fireflies are shown to be a very elusive group. So much so, Joel later in the game must practically travel all the way to Jackson in order to obtain their whereabouts from his brother Tommy, who was a former Firefly. But in that same breath of Tess saying they need to find a Firefly,
Just go find a Firefly. You won't have to look very far.
There you go. Queen Firefly.
it just so happens that the leader of the entire organisation is just around the corner, and she's in desperate need of their help. If that wasn't contrived enough, she just so happens to have their guns and the cure to humanity nearby. What a giant coincidence. This is just the main one, but there are many more. Like Joel never teaching Ellie how to swim between chapters. In Bill's town, the military truck is missing the car battery. Thankfully, they find it right next door, in a practically working truck thanks to Bill's partner. Ellie's switchblade calls into question why Joel just doesn't bring a knife around. And I can go on here. Hopefully you get the point. Now, two wrongs don't make a right. Just because part 1 is contrived in a lot of ways as well, doesn't excuse part 2. And to be fair, I think it's the sheer amount and how blatant they are in part 2 that is really the true problem here. Being a sequel, you expect less, not more. There is no denying, it's far from the pinpoint focus of the first game. They obviously wanted character in certain places at certain points, to have the desired events happen, but never truly considered how to believably get them there in a coherent way. To be fair to part 2, it's far more ambitious in its narrative than part 1 ever was. Don't get me wrong, part 1's story is incredibly well told for what it is. A broken man who we see lose his daughter, through a long journey, manages to rekindle that relationship many years later with another young girl. Obviously there's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it. It's a very compelling narrative, but isn't exactly pushing what a game narrative can do here. How the story really elevates itself is when you get to the ending. Joel's actions in the hospital recontextualize everything, having the player question whether they were playing as the hero or as the villain the whole time. The genius of it was, no matter how you feel Joel should lie on that spectrum, since we saw his journey from start to finish, it was fundamentally hard to judge him. The idea of blurring the line between protagonist and antagonist was at the core to that game's ending. It really justified The Last of Us as a story worth playing to the very end. Part 2 took that core concept of blurring the line between protagonist and antagonist that was present in the first game and made its whole game about exploring it. In that way, it's very true to the original.
And you wasted it!
There was a long build up to the finale. In fact, I would consider the moment Abby spares Ellie in the theatre, right up to her playing guitar at the end, as one long ending sequence. Despite the emphasis on Abby, this is Ellie's story, and it couldn't end without Ellie having a fight with Abby. The reverse in the theatre was just a prelude to the real thing. Dina alluded to earlier in the game about owning a farm when it was all over, so I'm glad we get to see it with her, Ellie and the baby. It's a nice reprieve before the last stretch of the game. Ellie practically throws away her whole life and her happy forever after with Dina, all to get to Abby. This section best illustrates what Ellie is willing to give up in order to achieve her goals, and emphasises how much Joel means to her. Ellie just continually suffers as things go on. Yes, she continues to go on. That, in and of itself, says a lot about what Joel's relationship meant to Ellie. The silent submachine gun Ellie gets in the last section lends a new atmosphere to the game. Like Ellie, who's been fighting on the back foot the whole game, now gains the upper hand in a way, as if nothing is going to stop her. It's such a simple thing. I mean, it's practically a video game tradition to give the player a powerful weapon at the end. But it works, just like the assault rifle in part 1. Thankfully, it subverts it slightly by reintroducing the body armor enemies in the last section, leading to probably the most challenging encounter in the entire game, akin to the hospital in part 1. Although we are told early on that Abby isn't going anywhere, Ellie receiving a brutal injury adds an underlying urgency to the whole thing, as who knows how long Ellie can keep this up for. After the last combat encounter of the game, we finally catch up with Abby. The build up to her reveal is nothing short of genius. The ending is a little padded, but I truly believe for this upcoming moment, it was all worth it. There's been a huge expectation since Joel's death. Now with Jesse dead, Tommy's life in shambles, and abandoning Dina with the baby at the farm, has only added to the anticipation all this has been building towards. Ellie by the end of the game has been to hell and back again, and now she's got Abby at her mercy, with her chance to put things right. Yet, when we finally get there, nothing seems right about it. Everyone on the cross is suffering. Looks like death would be a mercy. There's an eerie silence and atmosphere that gives you a sense that you're in a graveyard. When you move towards Abby, believing it's the woman with the blonde ponytail, only to her actual reveal to be behind you. It's a moment I won't forget for a long time. Abby looks as if she's at death's door. Her sickly appearance makes her completely unrecognisable. Ellie looks entirely conflicted and dejected by the whole thing, almost as if she's in a state of shock. She clearly wants Abby to be afraid for how she's going to make her suffer, but Abby appears as if she suffered more than anything Ellie could possibly do. Abby in truth just doesn't seem to care anymore. She seems practically unfazed by Ellie's appearance here, even showing Ellie to the boats on the shore. The final moment is so anticlimactic and frustrating, it actually becomes its greatest strength. I can feel Ellie's frustration, as I think we feel it as well. How can this all be for nothing? This is where I finally understood what the game was going for with Abby and Ellie's different campaigns. Protagonists usually risk life and limb in pursuit of some goal, often for the sake of others than for themselves. The 3 playable protagonists in The Last of Us are the opposite, as the emphasis is often on putting their own selfish reasons above the bigger picture. See, Joel, Ellie and Abby are more similar than they are different. Now, all 3 characters are tenacious when it comes to achieving their goals, but it goes further than that. There is a central thematic element that binds Joel, Ellie and Abby together, but it's not as simple or as shallow as revenge. It's grief, or really it's seeking catharsis for one's grief. All 3 characters are willing to do whatever it takes in order to achieve that catharsis. And I don't think I'm reading that deep into it. These are just surface level details. Joel ends the cure for humanity in order to replace the emotional loss of Sarah with Ellie. Abby gives up half a decade of her life, changes her whole body and mind, and gives up her relationship with Owen in order to avenge her father's death. Ellie becomes practically suicidal and self-destructive on her mission to deal with Abby over Joel's death. Ellie throughout the game has become more and more relentless in her search for catharsis over Joel's brutal killing. She wants them to suffer in the same way Abby made Joel suffer with the golf club. So, I don't buy the idea that the way Abby Group dies was a way to create some moral ambiguity for Ellie, so that people can argue that she's not morally reprehensible. Ellie has already killed countless people up to now, with no remorse. So instead, I believe every death of Abby's group seems to be intentionally designed to provide no gratification or satisfaction, in the way Joel's death did for Abby and some of her group. Leia is killed by the scars. Noah gets infected and still refuses to give up her friends. So, although Ellie acts some sort of revenge on her, it's already tainted by the spores. While Manny is killed by Tommy, Owen and Mel, Ellie is forced to kill, and with Mel being pregnant, just turns the whole thing into a very dark scenario. All that's left is Abby, but she's the only one that matters, as Abby is the one who made Joel suffer. So, She's the one who can provide Ellie with that catharsis. Finally giving Ellie some closure. Eventually, when you reach the boats on the shore, Ellie finally makes the fight happen. My favourite thing in this entire game is how Ellie must force the fight to happen. She's given everything for this moment, and she can't let it end this way. Not without trying, at least. Killing Abby isn't enough. She has to make her suffer for Joel. She needs that catharsis for his death. While Abby just doesn't seem to care anymore. She only wants Lev safe. Only when Ellie threatens Lev does Abby finally agree. The fight is a little janky, but it's as rough and as brutal as anyone could have wished for. Despite being quite restrictive, it lives up to the final boss fight we've all been waiting for. Ellie finally has the moment she's been waiting the entire game for when she starts drowning Abby. This is where we get a tiny glimpse of the final flashback. Even in the final moments of the game, it's been about Joel and Ellie's relationship, and it has been the whole time. It's not about Abby for Ellie. It's never been about revenge. It's always been about catharsis. It's clear to me that Ellie wants closure, but closure for what? Before this moment, back at the farmhouse, we see the flashback of Ellie and Dina at the dance. Ellie has a tender and happy moment with Dina. Ellie, I believe, has been living with the guilt of what Joel did up to now. So she angrily lashes out at Joel. Later, I think she realises in that moment, she wouldn't be having this wonderful experience with Dina without Joel stopping her from being sacrificed for the cure. Therefore, this is why I believe she's willing to start amending her broken relationship with Joel right after this moment, as that was the first moment of Ellie appreciating her own life again, and it wouldn't have been possible without Joel saving her. Ellie has been abandoned her whole life. Her mother, Riley, Marlene, and even Tess to a certain extent. Ellie's biggest fear is ending up alone.
Being by myself? I'm scared of ending up alone.
Now, although it took time, Joel is the only person to truly care and never abandon her. He cared about her so much that the fate of humanity didn't make a difference in his eyes. Now, Ellie has pushed herself beyond breaking point. She stabs, beats and shoots anyone in her way, all to have this moment. Now, after losing 2 of her fingers, she literally has Abby's life in the palm of her hands. If the entire objective of this game has been getting retribution for Joel, then why does Ellie look so sad? Ellie doesn't know Abby or anything she went through these past few days. Ellie doesn't care about her or Lev. She only cares about Joel. Not even Dina could convince her to put a stop to all this. So, in those final moments, when Ellie lets go, it's not because she suddenly forgives Abby due to an epiphany contained in a flashback. She hasn't decided to let her hatred go. It's not about ending a cycle. It's not because violence begets violence. Hatred begets hatred. It's truly because she's not getting the catharsis she's travelled all this way for. Even with Abby excruciatingly drowning in front of her, the pain hasn't gone away. The whole thing has been tainted. Lev looks unresponsive. Abby has already been brutally tortured and looks lifeless anyway. Although she puts up a good fight, flailing around in the water, she just looks pathetic. It's like that moment that Abby's waited so long to have with Joel, in Ellie's case, has been completely stolen from her. But why? In the last scene, Ellie returns to an empty home. She is sitting there unable to play the guitar. Then we finally get the answer to that question, to why she went through all this in the flashback with Joel. Ellie acts as if she hates Joel, and refused to speak to him for 2 years straight up to this point. In the flashback with Dina at the dance, Joel comes to defend Ellie, and all she does is belittle him in front of everyone. Given Joel's expression, it looks like it hurt him deeply. Despite how hurt Ellie is, and how she treats him, even if Joel could do it all over again in the hospital, he would still make that same choice. That's how much Ellie means to him. Ellie, on the other hand, never got the chance to show how much she cared about him. Think about it. We never get to see Joel and Ellie together in the present. Only are they together in the flashbacks. Just like Ellie, we feel like we've missed our chance to have that moment together again. It's one of the many reasons Joel's death is so devastating to her. Abby has stole that precious moment from her. See, the final flashback tells us that Ellie, is overcome with guilt. This is where we come back to Ellie begging for Joel to get up, and why it hits such an emotional note with me, as she is literally watching her last chance to show Joel how much she cared about him get devastatingly beaten away from her. See, the entire game has been about Ellie seeking relief for that missed chance, and she wants to do this by making Abby suffer. Ellie has so many regrets with Joel, and she's been trying desperately to achieve some release, but killing Abby just doesn't seem to achieve that release. Abby had become the embodiment of all of Ellie's suffering, but even with Abby's life in her hands, none of the pain seems to go away, as she's thinking about how she treated Joel right up until the end. Treated is the key word there. It's not about what Abby did to Joel that pains her so. It's about how Ellie herself treated him over the years. The fact that she never got to show him her true feelings. In the same way it doesn't matter who won the war between the Scars and the WLF, neither does Abby living or dying, as it was never really about that for Ellie. When she is drowning Abby and none of the pain is going away, Ellie in the end finally realises that. See, the difference between Abby and Ellie in their search for vengeance is that when Abby kills Joel, she finally receives her catharsis. She's now able to let that part of her life go and move on. Ellie killing Abby for a similar reason makes no difference, as Ellie is unable to let things go, because it was never about killing Abby, it was about receiving closure for Joel's death, and there was too many things left unsaid for her to get that catharsis by just killing Abby. Ellie was never able to have that cathartic experience. Ellie in the end hasn't done a complete 180 as a character. She doesn't stop killing Abby as a superficial way to attain some of her humanity. She doesn't automatically stay a good person by the end. She's still completely distraught over Joel's death and has continued to suffer. She only realises that killing Abby isn't going to make her pain or suffering go away. Or just to put it simply, Abby just doesn't matter. To deal with what happened to Joel, she must do that on her own. In the last scene, Ellie attempts the guitar one last time before putting it down. Just like her fingers, Joel isn't coming back. Just like the guitar will lay there unable to be played, so will the pain of his death lay there unable to be reconciled. And just like the guitar, all Ellie can do is leave it behind her and move forward. In part 1's ending, although Joel had done a very bad thing, you probably felt happy for him in the end, as he finally seemed content with his life again. By the end of part 2, no Ellie or the player is emotionally satisfied. We're unfulfilled and lack emotional satisfaction, just like Ellie. This is why Last of Us 2 might be the most earnest attempt at a sequel in a decade, and achieved exactly what it set out to do. So, although it's shallow in some respects, it's anything but a hollow sequel. Compared to its predecessor, Part 2 is a big step forward in nearly every way. The story is subtly more ambitious than Part 1, but it lacks the pinpoint narrative the original had, since its plot is far more muddled. The sequel thankfully does nothing to undermine any of Part 1's core decisions and consequences, only expands upon it. So already it deserves some credit in my book. Being able to take a step back, I can totally see the hate surrounding this game, and I can't help but be reminded of MGS2 and the backlash that game received when it first released. Every criticism that game received can be labelled at Part 2. The rug being pulled from underneath us with the whole bait and switch of the main protagonist, and the negative reception it received. The fact that both strive not to outdo its predecessor, but instead take it somewhere else entirely. Now, MGS is arguably braver of the two, but The Last of Us Part 2 efforts to create something new again shouldn't be understated. Video games have a bit of an image problem, with fun is touted as the most important aspect of any game. It's a very narrow way of thinking. In reality, Games should strive to create the intended emotion that they think would suit the overall experience. And I've hit on the core of the issue, and that is, what was the intended intention? Obviously it's about creating the right feeling at the right time, and this is where the art of it comes in. Clearly Part 2's intention was to create little gratification throughout the experience, something the ending captures beautifully. Now, don't get me wrong, it has a lot of messy areas, and I can say for certain Naughty Dog never intended the game to be boring, which it certainly can be, so the game can fail at its own merits at times. But on the whole, I believe it was successful. The game is greater than the original in every way. It's a longer game overall, although debatably, its scope exceeded its grasp on that front. It has more gameplay variety and depth, more ambitious and interesting level design, bigger environments with more considered layouts, smarter and more interesting enemy AI, and its set pieces outshine anything the original had to offer. Objectively, Part 2 is not a bad game. Objectively, its gameplay outdoes the original by its own merits. But does the sequel live up to its own predecessor? One of the most critically acclaimed games of recent memory? That's the question I'm trying to answer here. Well, I'd say the answer would be no. But in fairness to Part 2, it never tried to be. It tried to go somewhere new entirely. And at the very least, it earns my respect for that. Even though Part 2 is flawed in many ways, and Part 1 is arguably better, I've a huge amount of respect for what Neil Druckmann and his team wanted to achieve. I've no doubt people probably despise me for saying that, but it's the truth. Neil was asked to create the most anticipated sequel on consoles in decades, with its main goal of turning it into a franchise. There have been countless people in that same scenario, and look how safe they've played it in the sequel. Games that only want to cash in on the sequel, rather than striving to create something original again. Neil probably had the option to give it to someone else, or have it take place in a new area with original characters. Instead, Neil took a huge risk, taking a bold departure using the previously established, well-liked characters and making them shadows of the former selves, making the supposed villains more redeemable than the so-called heroes. Sure, it didn't reinvent the wheel, but neither did its predecessor, the game this is unfairly being maligned to. In the end, Last of Us Part 2 deserves both its praise and its criticism. But overall, it earns its respect to be called a sequel to one of the most critically acclaimed games of its time, and in my opinion, merits its own existence and the right to be called a sequel to the first game. Just like this review, The Last of Us Part 2 is either an unconventional look at loss, grief and revenge, or the ravings of a madman pushing an underlying agenda. But I'll let you decide that. What I can say for sure is that I'll be talking and thinking about this game more than any other of Naughty Dog's in the future. Hey guys, it's Jamie, kinda off the cuff here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Making it has been a bit of an Everest for me. I think I took on way too much. Far too little of a reward. At least you guys got some value out of all this effort. I'll be working on a Sekiro video next. Holy god. Hopefully it won't take as long as this one. So if you enjoyed the video and you want to help me out, just subscribe and like and whatever. And fingers crossed, you'll see me again soon.